Abandoned by her father after a rattlesnake's deadly strike, 12-year-old Emma lay dying alone in the wilderness as venom scorched through her veins. The wild horse that emerged from the forest shadows would not only save her life, but forever change her father's understanding of the world. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment on where you're watching from. Let's get started. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail that wound through the dense forest of Oak Creek Canyon. Emma Peterson, a bright-eyed 12-year-old with sun-kissed freckles and a perpetual smile, walked several paces ahead of her father, Richard. Her blonde hair, tied in a messy ponytail, bounced with each enthusiastic step she took. The father-daughter duo had embarked on what was supposed to be a bonding hike, a rare occurrence given Richard's demanding job as a corporate executive in Phoenix. "Emma, slow down," Richard called out, his voice tinged with irritation rather than concern. "You don't know these trails like you think you do." Emma rolled her eyes but slowed her pace nonetheless. This hiking trip had been her idea, a desperate attempt to connect with her increasingly distant father. Ever since her mother's death 3 years ago, Richard had buried himself in his work, leaving Emma in the care of a rotation of nannies and housekeepers. This weekend getaway to their rarely used cabin was meant to bridge the growing chasm between them. "Dad, look! Wildflowers!" Emma exclaimed, pointing to a patch of vibrant purple blooms nestled between the rocks. "Mom would have loved these." Richard's jaw tightened at the mention of his late wife. "Emma, please, let's just focus on the hike." His words came out harsher than intended, and he saw his daughter's shoulders slump in response. The trail narrowed as they ventured deeper into the canyon, the dense foliage creating dappled shadows on the ground. Emma had fallen silent, her earlier enthusiasm dampened by her father's cold response. Richard walked behind her, his mind already drifting back to the pending merger at work, barely noticing the natural beauty surrounding them. The peaceful silence was suddenly shattered by Emma's piercing scream. Richard's head snapped up to see his daughter frozen in terror, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Coiled in her path, its scales glistening in the patchy sunlight, was a rattlesnake, its distinctive tail vibrating in warning. "Dad!" Emma cried out, her voice trembling with fear. "Don't move, Emma," Richard commanded, his business voice taking over as he assessed the situation. "Just stay perfectly still." But the warning came too late. Whether from fear or instinct, Emma took a small step backward. The movement was enough to provoke the snake, which struck with lightning speed, its fangs sinking into Emma's ankle before retreating into the underbrush. Emma's scream echoed through the canyon as she collapsed to the ground, clutching her leg. Richard rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside his daughter. Blood was already seeping through her sock, and the bite area was beginning to swell alarmingly. "Dad, it hurts," Emma whimpered, tears streaming down her face. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a burning sensation that seemed to spread up her leg with each passing second. Richard's mind raced with fragments of information about snake bites. He needed to get the venom out, or was that outdated advice? Should he make a tourniquet? He needed to get her to a hospital, but they were miles from the cabin and even further from any medical facility. "I need to get help," he said, his voice unnaturally calm as panic bubbled beneath the surface. "Can you stand?" Emma tried to put weight on her injured leg, but crumpled back to the ground with a cry of pain. The swelling was spreading rapidly, and her skin had taken on an alarming reddish-purple hue around the bite. "I can't," she sobbed, the reality of their situation setting in. "It hurts too much." Richard pulled out his phone, but as expected, there was no signal in the canyon. They were completely cut off. He looked at his daughter, her face pale and beaded with sweat, and made a split-second decision. "I'm going to run back to the cabin and call for help," he said, already standing up. I'll be faster on my own. I need you to stay here and keep your leg elevated. I'll be back with help as quickly as I can." Emma's eyes widened with fear. "You're leaving me? Dad, please don't leave me alone." Her voice cracked with panic as she reached for him. Richard hesitated, torn between staying with his terrified daughter and the knowledge that every minute without medical attention increased the danger from the venom. "Emma, listen to me. I have to get help. The venom is spreading and we don't have much time. I promise I'll be back as soon as possible." Before Emma could protest further, Richard placed his water bottle and backpack beside her. "Keep drinking water. I'll be back with help before you know it." And with those words, he turned and began running back down the trail, his figure quickly disappearing among the trees. "Dad!" Emma called after him, her voice echoing uselessly in the vast canyon. But he was already gone, leaving her alone with the throbbing pain in her leg and the terrifying knowledge that a venomous snake could still be nearby. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Emma lay on the trail, her injured leg propped up on her father's backpack. The pain had transformed into a strange numbness, which somehow frightened her even more. Her thoughts became fuzzy, and the forest around her seemed to spin and shift. Was this the venom affecting her brain, or just fear? "Help," she whispered, her voice weak and trembling. "Someone please help me." As if in answer to her plea, a rustling sound came from the brush nearby. Emma froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Was the snake returning? Or perhaps something worse, a coyote or mountain lion drawn by the scent of blood? Instead, what emerged from the foliage was a magnificent wild horse, its chestnut coat gleaming in the sunlight. Emma blinked, wondering if the venom was causing her to hallucinate. Wild horses weren't uncommon in parts of Arizona, but she had never seen one this close to the hiking trails. The horse approached cautiously, its ears pricked forward in curiosity. It was a male, muscular and proud, with intelligent eyes that seemed to assess Emma's condition. Despite her pain and fear, Emma couldn't help but marvel at the creature's beauty. "Hello," she whispered, not wanting to startle the animal. "I don't suppose you know how to call 911? The horse nickered softly, as if responding to her voice. To Emma's amazement, it came closer, lowering its head to sniff at her injured leg. She remained perfectly still, partly from necessity and partly from wonder at this unexpected encounter. The horse's behavior was unlike anything Emma had ever heard about wild animals. Instead of being spooked by the scent of blood or the presence of a human, it seemed genuinely concerned. It circled her once, then settled on the ground beside her in a protective posture, its large body providing shade from the relentless sun. "Are you staying with me?" Emma asked, her voice weak but tinged with gratitude. The horse's presence was oddly comforting, a reminder that she wasn't completely alone in the vast wilderness. "I'm Emma," she continued, finding that talking helped distract from the pain and fear. "My dad went to get help. At least I hope he did." The horse's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and it turned its head to look at her with those deep, knowing eyes. Emma reached out a trembling hand, and to her surprise, the horse allowed her to touch its mane, the coarse hair surprisingly soft under her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Whether from pain, fear, or the unexpected kindness of this wild creature, she couldn't tell. All she knew was that in this moment, this horse was her only companion in a situation that grew more frightening with each passing minute. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the canyon, Emma's thoughts turned to her father. Had he reached the cabin? Had he called for help? Or had he abandoned her, just as he had emotionally abandoned her after her mother's death? The venom continued its silent work through her system, and Emma felt herself growing weaker. The horse, sensing her distress, moved closer, its warm body providing comfort against the cooling air. Emma leaned against its side, drawing strength from its steady presence. "Please hurry, Dad," she whispered into the gathering dusk, her voice lost among the rustling leaves and distant calls of birds returning to their nests. "Please don't forget about me." Night descended upon Oak Creek Canyon, wrapping Emma and her unlikely guardian in a blanket of darkness. The temperature dropped rapidly, as it often did in the Arizona wilderness, and Emma began to shiver uncontrollably. The snake's venom had spread further up her leg, which had now swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The pain came in waves, sometimes sharp and burning, other times a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to reach all the way to her bones. "It's so cold," Emma whispered through chattering teeth. Her eyes were heavy, and a strange lethargy had settled over her, making even the simple act of staying awake a monumental effort. She knew in some distant part of her mind that was still functioning clearly that she needed to stay conscious, that giving in to sleep might be dangerous. The wild horse, which had remained faithfully by her side, seemed to sense her distress. In a move that defied everything Emma knew about wild animals, it shifted its position, carefully maneuvering its body to curl more protectively around her small frame. The warmth emanating from the horse's body provided a shield against the chilling night air, and Emma gratefully pressed closer to its side. "Thank you," she murmured, her fingers weakly clutching at the horse's mane. "I don't know why you're helping me, but I'm glad you are." Miles away, Richard Peterson stumbled through the darkening forest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had been running for what felt like hours, his mind consumed by a singular thought: get help for Emma. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly before him, each bend and turn looking frustratingly similar in the fading light. Had he taken a wrong turn? Was he even on the right path anymore? Richard paused, bending over with his hands on his knees as he tried to catch his breath. Guilt gnawed at him, a persistent voice in his head questioning his decision to leave Emma alone. But what choice did he have? She needed medical attention, and quickly. Carrying her would have only slowed him down, potentially costing her life. Yet the image of her terrified face as he left her haunted him. The fear in her eyes, the desperate plea not to be abandoned, it reminded him too much of the way she had looked at him after her mother's funeral, when he had retreated into his work rather than facing their shared grief. "I'm coming, Emma," he muttered, straightening up and forcing his tired legs to move again. "Just hold on." Back at the site of the snakebite, Emma drifted in and out of consciousness, her thoughts becoming increasingly disjointed. The venom was affecting her more severely now, causing her vision to blur and her mind to wander. She thought of her mother, wondering if she would see her soon. She thought of her father, wondering if he had ever really loved her or if she had just been a burden to him after her mother died. The horse remained vigilant, its ears constantly moving, alert to every sound in the forest. When Emma's body temperature dropped further, it pressed even closer, sharing its warmth. When she moaned in pain, it nuzzled her gently, as if trying to comfort her. It was behavior so unusual, so seemingly deliberate, that had anyone witnessed it, they would have been astounded. As midnight approached, Emma's condition deteriorated further. Her breathing became shallow and irregular, and her skin took on a grayish pallor visible even in the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. The horse became increasingly agitated, getting up and pacing around her before returning to her side, as if uncertain what to do but unwilling to leave. Finally, in what seemed like a moment of decision, the horse gently nudged Emma's shoulder with its muzzle. When she didn't respond beyond a weak moan, it became more insistent, pushing at her with greater force. "What?" Emma murmured, her voice barely audible. "What do you want?" The horse moved to her uninjured side and lowered itself to the ground, lying flat beside her. Then, In a series of movements that seemed impossibly deliberate, it used its head to push against Emma, trying to roll her onto its back. Even in her venom-addled state, Emma understood what the horse was attempting. "You want to carry me?" she whispered, disbelief momentarily cutting through the fog in her mind. "But you're wild. You can't." The horse persisted, and with the last of her strength, Emma managed to drape herself across its back. She had ridden horses at summer camp years ago, but this was entirely different. She had no saddle, no reins, nothing to hold on to except the horse's mane, which she clutched weakly with trembling fingers. "Please," she whispered into the horse's ear, "please help me." As if understanding her plea, the horse carefully rose to its feet, balancing with extraordinary care to ensure Emma didn't fall. Then, with a gentle gait that minimized jostling its precious cargo, the horse began to move through the forest, following some path known only to itself. Meanwhile, Richard had finally reached the cabin. He burst through the door and immediately grabbed the landline phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice was a lifeline in his sea of panic. "My daughter's been bitten by a rattlesnake on the Oak Creek Trail," he explained breathlessly. "I had to leave her to get help. She's 12 years old. The bite is on her ankle. It happened about 4 hours ago." "Sir, we'll dispatch search and rescue immediately," the dispatcher assured him. "Can you give us the exact location where you left your daughter?" Richard described the location as best he could, the guilt intensifying as he realized how vague his directions sounded. The trail had so many similar-looking sections, and in his panic, he hadn't noted any specific landmarks near Emma. "I need to go back for her," he said, already moving toward the door. "I'll meet the rescue team on the trail." "Sir, it's dark now, and the rescue team is trained for night operations. You could get lost yourself. The best thing you can do is wait at the trailhead to guide them." Richard wanted to argue, but the logic was undeniable. Getting lost himself wouldn't help Emma. "All right," he agreed reluctantly, "but please hurry. She's all alone out there." Except Emma wasn't alone. The wild horse continued its careful journey through the darkness, carrying its semi-conscious passenger with extraordinary gentleness. It moved with purpose, avoiding low-hanging branches and choosing the smoothest parts of the terrain, somehow understanding the fragility of the human on its back. Emma drifted between awareness and unconsciousness, occasionally opening her eyes to see moonlit trees passing by. Was this real, or a hallucination brought on by the venom? She couldn't be sure anymore. All she knew was the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath her and the strange sense of safety it provided. "Where are you taking me?" she whispered, but received no answer beyond the continued steady pace of the horse's hooves on the forest floor. In the distance, sirens wailed as emergency vehicles approached the trailhead where Richard now waited, pacing anxiously under the harsh glare of floodlights that had been set up to illuminate the area. A team of search and rescue personnel was gathering, equipped with medical supplies, stretchers, and powerful flashlights. "We're ready to head out," the team leader informed Richard. "We'll find your daughter, sir. Try to stay positive." Richard nodded numbly, the reality of the situation hitting him with full force. His daughter was fighting for her life in the darkness, alone and afraid, because he had left her behind, just as he had been doing emotionally for the past 3 years. "Please," he whispered, not sure if he was addressing the rescue team, some higher power, or Emma herself. "Please don't let it be too late." The wild horse moved with unwavering determination through the moonlit forest, its hooves finding purchase on the uneven ground with remarkable precision. Emma lay draped across its back, her consciousness fading in and out like a weak radio signal. In her more lucid moments, she marveled at the surreal nature of her situation, rescued from certain death by a wild animal that seemed to possess an almost human understanding of her plight. "Are you real?" she murmured into the horse's mane, her words slurring slightly. Or are you just something I made up because I'm dying? The horse's ear twitched backward at the sound of her voice, but it maintained its steady pace, navigating the tangled underbrush and rocky terrain with purposeful strides. There was an intelligence in its movements that defied explanation, a deliberateness that suggested more than animal instinct at work. As they ventured deeper into the canyon, the horse suddenly paused, its ears pricked forward in alert attention. Emma felt its muscles tense beneath her. Something had disturbed the night, a sound, a scent, a presence that the horse had detected long before any human could have noticed. After a moment of stillness, the horse changed direction, veering away from whatever had caused its concern. It moved faster now, its gait quickening from a walk to a trot, jolting Emma painfully with each stride. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, instinctively understanding the need for silence. Meanwhile, the search and rescue team had begun their mission, fanning out along the trail with powerful flashlights cutting through the darkness. Richard walked alongside the team leader, a weathered man named Mike, who had been rescuing lost hikers and injured climbers for over 20 years. "How much farther to where you left her?" Mike asked, his voice professionally neutral, without a hint of the judgment Richard felt he deserved. "I'm not sure," Richard admitted, the knot of guilt in his stomach tightening. "Everything looks different in the dark. I think we're getting close, though." Mike nodded, then spoke into his radio to update the rest of the team. "Keep your eyes peeled for any sign of the girl. She's wearing a blue t-shirt and hiking shorts. Blonde hair." Richard winced at the impersonal description of his daughter. Emma was so much more than that. She was bright and curious, with her mother's laugh and a passion for animals that had manifested almost as soon as she could talk. When had he last truly seen her, appreciated her for the remarkable person she was becoming? The realization that he might never get the chance to make things right sent a fresh wave of despair washing over him. "We'll find her," Mike said, correctly interpreting Richard's expression. "Kids are resilient. Even with a snake bite, she's got time if we get to her soon." Richard nodded gratefully, though the reassurance did little to ease his torment. He knew the statistics, had researched rattlesnake bites after receiving the cabin years ago. Without anti-venom, the outlook was grim, especially for someone of Emma's size, and they had already lost precious hours. The search party continued methodically along the trail, calling Emma's name at regular intervals. Their voices echoed eerily through the canyon, but no response came. They reached the area Richard believed he had left Emma, only to find it deserted. "She was right here," Richard insisted, panic rising in his voice as he pointed to a flat section of the trail. "I left her right here with my backpack and water bottle." Mike crouched down, examining the ground with his flashlight. "There are signs of disturbance here," he confirmed. "And look, bloodstains on the rocks." He stood up and surveyed the area, his experienced eyes picking up details Richard missed. "And these are hoof prints. Looks like a horse has been through here and recently." "A horse?" Richard echoed, confused. "There aren't any domestic horses out here." "Wild horses sometimes come down from the high country," Mike explained. "But they usually avoid the hiking trails, especially during the day." He continued examining the ground, following the tracks a short distance. "The strange thing is, these tracks show the horse was standing here for some time. Then it appears to have moved off in that direction." He pointed toward a dense section of forest that veered away from the established trail. "Could a horse have taken her?" Richard asked, immediately feeling foolish for even suggesting it. Mike gave him a measured look. "Under normal circumstances, I'd say absolutely not. Wild horses don't approach humans, let alone interact with them. But these tracks..." He hesitated. "The pattern is unusual, and there are no signs that Emma walked away from this spot." He raised his radio again. "Team, we need to adjust our search pattern." We're looking for both the girl and possibly a horse she may be with. Expand the search to the northwest, away from the trail." Richard stared into the darkness beyond the trail, trying to imagine what might have happened. Had a wild horse actually approached Emma? And if so, why? The scenario seemed impossible, yet the evidence suggested something extraordinary had occurred. "Let's move," Mike said, already heading in the direction of the hoofprints. "If she's mobile, even on horseback, that's a good sign. It means she was conscious enough to hold on." As the search party adjusted their course, Emma continued her surreal midnight journey. The horse had found a game trail, narrow but relatively clear, and was following it with the confidence of one who knew these woods intimately. Emma's leg had gone completely numb, which she vaguely recognized as a bad sign, but she was beyond fear now, drifting in a strange state between delirium and acceptance. The moonlight filtering through the trees created an otherworldly landscape, shadows and silver merging and separating in a hypnotic dance. Emma watched through half-closed eyes, wondering if this was what dying felt like. This peaceful detachment, this dreamy unreality. "If I don't make it," she whispered to the horse, "thank you for not leaving me alone." The horse's ear flicked back again, and it nickered softly, almost as if in protest of her fatalistic words. Then, without warning, it stopped and raised its head, staring intently ahead. Emma tried to focus on whatever had caught its attention, but her vision was too blurred to make out anything in the distance. A moment later, she heard what the horse had already detected: voices, distant but drawing nearer, and the unmistakable beams of flashlights sweeping through the trees. The search party had changed direction and was now moving toward them. The horse remained still, as if deliberating. Emma felt its muscles tense again, sensed its natural instinct to flee from humans warring with some other impulse. For a terrible moment she feared it would run, carrying her deeper into the wilderness, away from her only chance of survival. "Please," she breathed, her fingers weakly tightening in its mane. "Please take me to them." Whether it was her plea or its own decision, the horse suddenly moved forward, picking up its pace as it headed directly toward the approaching lights and voices. Emma closed her eyes, surrendering completely to whatever fate awaited her, aware only of the rhythmic movement beneath her and the growing sounds of human presence ahead. Richard's voice reached her first, calling her name with a desperation that penetrated even her venom-addled consciousness. "Emma! Emma, where are you?" The horse emerged from the dense underbrush into a small clearing, just as the search party entered from the opposite side. For one frozen moment, humans and horse stared at each other in mutual shock. The rescuers confronted with the astonishing sight of a wild horse bearing the semi-conscious child they had been searching for, and the horse suddenly face to face with a group of startled humans holding blinding lights. "Emma!" Richard cried, taking an instinctive step forward. The wild horse reared slightly, startled by the sudden appearance of multiple humans and the harsh beams of their flashlights. Emma slipped precariously on its back, her weakened grasp on its mane no longer enough to keep her secure. Richard's heart stopped as he watched his daughter begin to slide sideways, her limp body unable to correct its position. "Don't move," Mike commanded the group, raising his hand to halt their advance. "Everyone freeze and lower your lights. We're spooking the horse." The team immediately complied, dimming their flashlights and remaining perfectly still. In the softer light, Richard could see Emma more clearly, her face pale and drawn, her injured leg grotesquely swollen. She was barely conscious, her eyes fluttering as she struggled to stay aware of her surroundings. "Emma," he called softly, fighting the urge to run to her. "Emma, it's Dad. I'm here." At the sound of his voice, Emma's eyes opened wider, focusing with difficulty on his face. "Dad," she whispered, her voice so faint he could barely hear it. "You came back." The simple statement, delivered without accusation but with a hint of surprise, struck Richard like a physical blow. Had she truly believed he wouldn't return for her? The thought was unbearable. "Of course I came back," he said, his voice breaking. "I would never leave you, Emma." The horse, which had been watching the humans warily, seemed to relax slightly at the gentle tone of their voices. It lowered its head, still alert, but no longer poised to flee. Mike, observing the animal closely, made a subtle gesture to the team's medic. "We need to get to her," he murmured. "That snake bite looks bad. She needs the anti-venom immediately." The medic, a woman named Sarah, nodded her understanding. "Let me approach first," she suggested. "Slowly and alone. The horse might be less threatened by a single person." Mike agreed, and Sarah began to move forward with exquisite caution, her movements smooth and deliberate. She had lowered her flashlight to the ground, providing just enough illumination to see without blinding the horse. "Hey there," she called softly, addressing both Emma and the horse. "I'm here to help. Emma, can you hear me? I need to get you down from there so I can look at your leg." Emma nodded weakly, but it was the horse's reaction that astonished everyone present. Instead of backing away from Sarah's approach, it stepped forward to meet her, almost as if it understood her purpose. It came within a few feet of her, and then, in a movement that left the entire search party speechless, carefully knelt down on its front legs, lowering Emma closer to the ground. "My God," Mike breathed, voicing what everyone was thinking. "It's like it knows exactly what we need." Sarah, recovering quickly from her shock, moved forward and gently lifted Emma from the horse's back. The moment the girl was safely in the medic's arms, the horse stood up again, backing away a few steps but not fleeing. It stood watching, its ears forward with apparent interest, as Sarah carried Emma to a flat area where she could properly examine her. Richard rushed to his daughter's side, dropping to his knees beside her. "Emma, I'm so sorry," he said, taking her cold hand in his. "I should never have left you alone." Emma's eyes, glassy with pain and the effects of the venom, found his. "The horse stayed with me," she said, her words slurring slightly. "It protected me, kept me warm." Sarah was already cutting away Emma's pant leg to expose the bite. Richard gasped at the sight. The area around the puncture wounds was severely swollen and discolored, with angry red streaks extending up her calf. Sarah's expression grew grave as she examined it. "We need to administer the anti-venom now," she said, opening her medical kit. "The envenomation is severe and she's showing signs of systemic effects." As Sarah prepared the injection, Richard continued holding Emma's hand, overwhelmed by the reality of how close he had come to losing her. Not just tonight, but over the past 3 years as he had gradually withdrawn from her life, buried in his own grief and work. "You're going to be okay, sweetie," he promised, squeezing her hand gently. "We're going to get you to a hospital and you'll be fine." Emma's gaze drifted past him, focusing on the wild horse that still stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the proceedings with an unnervingly human-like attention. "Dad," she whispered. "The horse. Don't let them hurt it." Richard followed her gaze, seeing the magnificent animal in a new light, not as a wild creature to be feared or avoided, but as the miraculous savior of his daughter's life. "No one will hurt it," he assured her. "I promise." Sarah administered the anti-venom, then began preparing Emma for transport. "We need to get her to the hospital as quickly as possible," she told Richard. "The anti-venom will help, but she needs comprehensive care. We have a helicopter waiting at a clearing about half a mile from here." The team worked efficiently, transferring Emma to a stretcher and securing her for the journey. Throughout the process, the wild horse remained, watching from a respectful distance, its presence a continuing source of wonder for the rescue team. "I've never seen anything like it," Mike commented to Richard as they prepared to move out. "Wild horses don't behave this way. They don't approach humans. They certainly don't let people ride them, and they absolutely don't stick around once other humans arrive. This is extraordinary. Richard nodded, unable to find words adequate to express what he was feeling. The horse had done what he had failed to do. It had stayed with Emma, protected her, and ultimately saved her life by bringing her closer to where the search party could find her. As the team lifted Emma's stretcher and prepared to carry her to the helicopter, Richard approached the horse slowly. It watched him come, its ears forward, showing no sign of fear. "Thank you," Richard said simply, feeling somewhat foolish talking to an animal, but compelled by a gratitude too profound to contain. "I don't know how or why you helped my daughter, but thank you." The horse regarded him steadily, its dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. Then, in a gesture that sent shivers down Richard's spine, it dipped its head once, almost like a nod of acknowledgement. Without another movement, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the forest as silently as it had appeared. Richard stood staring after it for a long moment, until Mike's voice called him back to reality. "We need to move, Mr. Peterson. The helicopter's waiting." The journey to the clearing was arduous, with the team carefully maneuvering the stretcher through the rough terrain. Emma drifted in and out of consciousness, but her condition had stabilized somewhat thanks to the anti-venom. Richard walked beside her, holding her hand whenever the path allowed, speaking gentle words of encouragement. "You're going to be fine, Emma," he repeated, as much to reassure himself as her. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." In her moments of lucidity, Emma's thoughts returned to the horse. "It knew, Dad," she whispered once. "It knew I needed help. How did it know?" Richard had no answer, only a growing sense that they had experienced something beyond ordinary explanation, a mystery that defied the rational world he had always inhabited. When they reached the clearing, the helicopter was already waiting, its rotors creating a wind that whipped through the trees. The medical team quickly loaded Emma aboard, with Richard climbing in beside her. As the helicopter lifted off, Richard looked down at the dark forest below, wondering if somewhere in its depths a wild horse was watching their departure. The helicopter touched down on the hospital helipad with practiced precision, its rotors gradually slowing as medical staff rushed forward with a gurney. Emma had remained stable during the flight, but her condition was still critical. The venom had been in her system for hours, far longer than was optimal for treatment, and the damage to the tissue around the bite was extensive. Richard followed as they wheeled Emma through the hospital corridors, the bright fluorescent lights a harsh contrast to the moonlit forest they had just left. He felt disoriented, as if he had stepped from one world into another, from a realm where wild horses rescued lost children to the sterile, ordered environment of modern medicine. "Sir, you'll need to wait here," a nurse told him firmly but kindly, stopping him at the entrance to the emergency treatment area. "The doctors need space to work. I promise we'll update you as soon as we can." Richard nodded numbly, watching as they wheeled Emma through the double doors, her small form dwarfed by the gurney and the medical equipment surrounding her. The doors swung shut, leaving him alone in the waiting area, still wearing his dirt-stained hiking clothes, his mind replaying the events of the night in an endless loop. He sank into an uncomfortable plastic chair, his body suddenly registering the exhaustion he had been holding at bay through sheer adrenaline. The guilt that had been his constant companion since leaving Emma on the trail surged anew, accompanied now by a bewildering mixture of gratitude and disbelief when he thought of the horse. How had a wild animal known to help his daughter? Why had it stayed with her, protected her, and then carried her toward rescue? None of it made sense within the framework of the rational, orderly world Richard had built his life around. He was a man who dealt in corporate strategies and balance sheets, in measurable outcomes and logical decisions. What had happened tonight existed outside those parameters, in a realm he had no language to describe. Hours passed, marked only by the monotonous ticking of the wall clock and the occasional passing of hospital staff. Richard called his sister Claire, who promised to drive up from Phoenix immediately. He answered the questions of police officers who needed to file a report about the incident, but mostly he waited, trapped in a purgatory of uncertainty and regret. Finally, a doctor emerged, looking tired but not grim, a detail Richard clung to desperately. "Mr. Peterson, I'm Dr. Abernathy. I've been treating your daughter." Richard stood up so quickly he felt lightheaded. "How is she? Is she going to be okay?" Dr. Abernathy gestured for him to sit back down and took the chair beside him. "Emma is stable now. The anti-venom administered in the field probably saved her life, and we've given her additional doses here. The good news is that we believe we've neutralized all the venom in her system." Richard exhaled sharply, feeling some of the tension leave his body. "Thank God." However, the doctor continued, her expression growing more serious. "The venom was in her system for an extended period, and it has caused significant tissue damage around the bite area. There's also some concern about potential kidney damage, which we're monitoring closely." "What does that mean for her recovery?" Richard asked, his momentary relief giving way to fresh worry. "It means she's not out of the woods yet. She'll need to stay in the hospital for at least a week, possibly longer. The damaged tissue will need time to heal, and we'll be running regular tests to assess her kidney function." Dr. Abernathy paused, studying Richard's face. "But Emma is young and otherwise healthy. I've seen patients recover from worse snake bites. There's every reason to be optimistic." Richard nodded, clinging to those last words. "Can I see her?" "She's sedated now and will probably sleep through the night, but yes, you can sit with her." The doctor stood up. "One thing I'm curious about, Mr. Peterson. The paramedics mentioned something about a wild horse. They said it was carrying Emma when they found her." Richard hesitated, unsure how to explain what had happened without sounding delusional. "Yes," he said finally. "A wild horse found Emma after I left to get help. It stayed with her and somehow brought her closer to the search party." Dr. Abernathy's expression was a mixture of skepticism and wonder. "That's extraordinary. Wild horses generally avoid humans at all costs." "I know," Richard replied simply. "I can't explain it. None of us can." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "Well, however it happened, your daughter is very lucky. Without that intervention, given the severity of the envenomation and the time that had passed." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Richard understood perfectly what she was saying. Without the horse, Emma would have died. She led him to Emma's room in the ICU, where his daughter lay surrounded by machines monitoring her vital signs. An IV dripped medication into her arm, and her injured leg was elevated, heavily bandaged. Her face was pale but peaceful in sleep, looking younger than her 12 years. Richard pulled a chair to her bedside and gently took her hand, careful not to disturb the IV. "I'm here, Emma," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." As the night deepened, Richard maintained his vigil, dozing occasionally, but never leaving Emma's side. Nurses came and went, checking vitals and adjusting equipment, but the rhythm of the hospital night shift faded into the background of his consciousness, overshadowed by the tumult of his thoughts. He thought about the past 3 years, about how he had gradually withdrawn from Emma's life after her mother's death. It had been easier to immerse himself in work than to face his grief, or worse, to face Emma's grief, which mirrored his own so painfully. He had provided for her material needs, hiring nannies and housekeepers to care for her, but he had failed to give her what she truly needed: his presence, his love, his time. And tonight, when she had needed him most, he had left her alone in the wilderness. He had made what seemed like the logical choice, getting help as quickly as possible, but in doing so, he had abandoned her just as surely as he had been doing emotionally for years. The wild horse had done what he had not. It had stayed. It had provided warmth and comfort. It had, against all logic and natural instinct, protected his child when he had failed to do so. The first rays of dawn were filtering through the hospital blinds when Emma stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. She looked confused for a moment, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, before her gaze settled on Richard. "Dad," she murmured, her voice hoarse and weak. Richard leaned forward, squeezing her hand gently. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're in the hospital. You're going to be okay." Emma's eyes searched his face, as if confirming his presence was real, and not another venom-induced hallucination. "The horse," she said, the memory clearly returning. "It saved me." Richard nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "It was so strange, Dad," Emma continued, her words slow and slightly slurred from the medication. "It was like it understood everything, like it knew exactly what I needed." "I know," Richard said softly. "I saw it too. None of us could believe it." Emma's eyes began to drift closed again, the effort of conversation exhausting her limited strength. But before she slipped back into sleep, she murmured, "It reminded me of Mom, the way it looked at me, like it knew me." Richard sat frozen, those words echoing in his mind long after Emma had fallen asleep again. It reminded me of Mom. What did that mean? Was it just the delirious thought of a child in crisis? Or was there something more to it? Something that existed in the same inexplicable realm as a wild horse that defied all natural behavior to save a human child? Claire arrived at the hospital mid-morning, her face drawn with worry as she hurried into Emma's room. She stopped short at the sight of her niece lying pale and still among the tangle of medical equipment, her injured leg elevated and heavily bandaged. "Oh my God," she breathed, her hand going to her mouth. She turned to Richard, who was still sitting in the same chair where he had spent the night. "How is she?" "Stable," Richard replied, his voice rough from exhaustion. "The doctor says she's responding well to the anti-venom, but there's significant tissue damage. They're also monitoring her kidneys." Claire moved to Emma's bedside, gently brushing a strand of hair from the girl's forehead. Emma stirred slightly but didn't wake. "What happened out there, Richard? On the phone, you mentioned something about a wild horse?" Richard ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble that had accumulated during the long night. The events seemed even more surreal in the harsh light of day, in this sterile hospital room so far removed from the moonlit forest. But Claire was looking at him expectantly, waiting for an explanation he wasn't sure he could provide. "We were hiking," he began, the words coming slowly as he tried to make sense of it all. "Emma was ahead of me on the trail when she encountered a rattlesnake. It bit her before I could warn her." He paused, the guilt washing over him anew. "I knew I needed to get help quickly. The cabin was miles back and there was no cell service, so I left her to go for help." He couldn't meet Claire's eyes as he continued. "I made it to the cabin and called 911. A search and rescue team came and we went back for her. But when we got to the spot where I'd left her, she was gone." Claire's eyes widened. "Gone? But how?" "We found hoof prints," Richard interrupted. "A wild horse had been there. And then, as we were searching, we found them both. The horse was carrying Emma on its back, bringing her toward us." He looked up at his sister, expecting disbelief, but Claire's expression was one of wonder rather than skepticism. "That's incredible," she said softly. "But why would a wild horse do that?" Richard shook his head. "I don't know. The search team leader said he'd never seen anything like it. Wild horses don't approach humans, let alone interact with them the way this one did with Emma." He hesitated, then added, "Right before she fell asleep again this morning, Emma said the horse reminded her of Sarah." Claire's eyes filled with tears at the mention of her sister-in-law, Emma's mother. "What do you think she meant by that?" "I don't know," Richard admitted. "Maybe it was just the medication or the after effects of the venom. But—" He trailed off, unsure how to articulate the strange feeling that had been growing in him since witnessing the horse's behavior. "But what?" Claire prompted. Richard shook his head again. "Nothing. It's been a long night and I'm not thinking clearly." Claire studied him for a moment, then nodded, not pressing the issue. "You look exhausted. Why don't you go get some coffee and something to eat? I'll stay with Emma." Richard wanted to refuse, to insist on maintaining his vigil, but the truth was he was running on empty. He needed food and caffeine if he was going to be any use to Emma when she woke up again. "All right," he agreed reluctantly. "I won't be long." As he made his way to the hospital cafeteria, Richard's mind returned to Emma's words about the horse. It reminded me of Mom, the way it looked at me, like it knew me. What could that possibly mean? Was Emma suggesting some kind of, reincarnation? The spirit of her mother somehow manifesting in a wild horse? The idea was absurd, the kind of magical thinking he would have dismissed out of hand in any other context. But the horse's behavior had been so inexplicable, so contrary to everything he knew about wild animals. It had protected Emma, kept her warm, carried her to safety. Actions that seemed motivated by something beyond mere animal instinct. Could there be some explanation that existed outside the boundaries of his rational understanding? Sarah had loved horses. It was one of the first things he had learned about her when they met in college, that she had grown up riding and had never lost her passion for the animals. She had often talked about getting Emma riding lessons when she was old enough, a plan that had been derailed by Sarah's unexpected death from an aneurysm 3 years ago. Richard paused in the middle of the cafeteria, coffee cup in hand, as a memory suddenly surfaced. A few weeks before Sarah died, they had taken a day trip to a wild horse sanctuary not far from Phoenix. He remembered Sarah standing at the fence, watching the horses graze in the distance, with Emma perched on her hip. "They're so beautiful," Sarah had said, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. "So free. Sometimes I think they understand more than we give them credit for." At the time, Richard had smiled indulgently, attributing her words to romantic sentiment rather than literal belief. But now, in light of what had happened, he found himself wondering if Sarah had sensed something he had missed, some deeper intelligence or awareness in these animals that defied conventional understanding. He shook his head, trying to clear it of these fanciful thoughts. He was exhausted and emotionally drained, grasping at straws to make sense of the inexplicable. The more logical explanation was that the horse had simply been an unusually tame specimen, perhaps one that had had previous contact with humans. The fact that it had approached Emma and allowed her on its back was certainly unusual, but not necessarily supernatural. But even as he tried to rationalize it, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something truly extraordinary had occurred in that forest, something that had saved his daughter's life and that might, just might, have a connection to Sarah that he couldn't yet comprehend. When he returned to Emma's room, coffee and sandwich in hand, he found her awake and talking quietly with Claire. Her color was better, though she still looked weak and tired. Her face lit up when she saw him, a reaction that sent a pang through his heart. How long had it been since his presence had brought such obvious joy to his daughter? "Dad," she said, her voice stronger than it had been earlier. "Aunt Claire says the doctors think I'm going to be okay." Richard set his food aside and moved to her bedside, taking her hand. "That's right, sweetheart. Your body is fighting the venom really well. You're going to be just fine." Emma nodded, Then her expression grew more serious. "I've been telling Aunt Claire about the horse. She doesn't believe me." Claire shot Richard an apologetic look. "I didn't say I don't believe you, honey. I just said it sounds very unusual for a wild horse to behave that way." Emma looked between them, her brow furrowed with determination despite her weakened state. "It wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. The horse knew exactly what to do to help me. It kept me warm when I was cold. It carried me when I couldn't walk. It found the search party." Her voice took on a note of frustration. "I know it sounds crazy, but it wasn't acting like a normal horse. It was like it was thinking, like it understood everything that was happening." Richard and Claire exchanged glances, neither sure how to respond to Emma's insistence. Finally, Richard said gently, "We believe you, Emma. We all saw how the horse behaved when the search party found you. No one can explain it, but we all witnessed it." Emma seemed satisfied with Richard's acknowledgement, though a shadow of doubt remained in her eyes. She was old enough to recognize when adults were humoring her, and Richard could see that she sensed their skepticism about her interpretation of events, even if they believed the basic facts of what had happened. "I want to find it again," she said suddenly, her voice small but determined. "When I get better, I want to go back and look for the horse." Richard exchanged another glance with Claire, concern evident in both their expressions. "Emma, even if we could find the exact area, the chances of locating that specific horse are very slim," he explained gently. "Wild horses roam over large territories, and they don't stay in one place for long." "This one would," Emma insisted, her eyes bright with a certainty that unsettled Richard. "It would come if I called it. I know it would." Before Richard could formulate a response, Dr. Abernathy entered the room, bringing a welcome interruption to the increasingly difficult conversation. The doctor smiled warmly at Emma as she approached the bed. "Well, look who's awake and talking. That's a very good sign, Emma. How are you feeling?" Emma's attention shifted reluctantly from the topic of the horse. "My leg hurts a lot," she admitted, "and I feel really tired." "Both of those things are to be expected," Dr. Abernathy assured her, checking the monitors and IV lines. "The venom takes a toll on your body, and healing from a snake bite is hard work. The pain medication we're giving you should help with the discomfort, but it can make you sleepy too." She turned to Richard and Claire. "I'd like to examine Emma's leg now, and then we'll be drawing some blood for another round of tests. It might be a good time for you both to take a break, get some fresh air." Richard started to protest, unwilling to leave Emma's side again, but Claire put a gentle hand on his arm. "The doctor's right, Richard. Emma will be fine for a little while, and you've been here all night. Let's get some air and come back refreshed." Emma looked apprehensively between the adults. "You'll come back soon, right, Dad?" The note of uncertainty in her voice made Richard's heart constrict. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Of course I will, sweetheart. I promise. We'll just take a short walk outside, and we'll be back before you know it." Emma nodded, seemingly reassured, and Richard followed Claire out of the room with a heavy heart. The anxiety in Emma's question, "You'll come back soon, right, Dad?" echoed in his mind, carrying with it the weight of his past failures as a father. Of course she would doubt him. He had given her every reason to. The hospital was located on the outskirts of Sedona, and a small garden area provided a peaceful retreat for patients and visitors. Richard and Claire found an empty bench beneath the shade of a juniper tree, the red rock formations of the surrounding landscape creating a stunning backdrop. For a few minutes, they sat in companionable silence, the desert breeze bringing welcome relief from the hospital's recycled air. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice gentle but direct. "You need to talk about what happened out there, Richard. Not just the facts, but how you feel about it." Richard stiffened slightly. Claire had always been perceptive, able to read him in ways few others could. It was both comforting and unsettling, especially now when his emotions were so raw and confused. "I don't know what to say," he admitted after a moment. "I left my daughter alone in the wilderness after she'd been bitten by a rattlesnake. And while I was gone, some inexplicable thing happened involving a wild horse that behaved in ways that wild horses simply don't behave." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. "None of it makes sense, Claire. None of it." "Maybe it doesn't need to make sense," Claire suggested. "Maybe it just is what it is. Something extraordinary that saved Emma's life." Richard shook his head. "That's not how the world works. Animals don't just decide to rescue humans. There has to be some explanation, something I'm missing." Claire studied him for a moment. "You know, not everything in life can be explained or categorized, Richard. Sometimes things happen that defy rational explanation." She paused, then added softly, "Sarah used to say that all the time, remember? That there was more to the world than what we could measure or prove." The mention of his late wife brought a fresh wave of emotion. "Emma said the horse reminded her of Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The way it looked at her," she said, "like it knew her." Claire didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of those words settle between them. When she did speak, her tone was thoughtful, rather than dismissive. "Sarah always had a special connection with horses. Remember how they would always come right up to her, even the ones that were supposedly skittish? She had a gift." Richard nodded, the memories flooding back. Sarah at the riding stables where they had gone for her birthday one year, the way the horses had gravitated to her, nuzzling her hands and pockets for treats, responding to her voice with an attentiveness that the stable hands had remarked upon. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, not sure he wanted to hear the answer. Claire shrugged slightly. "I'm not suggesting anything specific. I'm just saying that maybe there are connections and forces in this world that we don't fully understand. And maybe, just maybe, whatever happened with that horse wasn't entirely random or meaningless." Richard wanted to argue, to insist on a rational explanation, but the events of the past 24 hours had shaken his certainty in a predictable, explainable world. Instead, he found himself considering Claire's words, turning them over in his mind as he stared out at the red rock formations that seemed ancient and mysterious in the midday sun. "I've been a terrible father," he said abruptly, the words escaping before he could reconsider them. "Not just yesterday when I left her alone, but for the past 3 years. Ever since Sarah died, I've been absent. Even when I'm physically present, I'm not really there for Emma." Claire's expression softened with compassion. "You've been grieving, Richard. Grief can make us do things we later regret." "That's no excuse," Richard replied, shaking his head. "Emma was grieving too. She lost her mother, and then in many ways she lost her father too. She needed me, and I wasn't there for her. But you're here now," Claire pointed out. "You haven't stopped holding her hand since I arrived at the hospital. That matters, Richard." Richard considered this, wondering if it was true, if his presence now could begin to make up for years of emotional distance. "When I saw her on that horse," he said slowly, "when I realized how close I came to losing her forever, it was like waking up from a long sleep. Suddenly everything that had seemed so important, work, deadlines, meetings, none of it mattered. Only Emma mattered." Claire nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Then hold on to that feeling, Richard. Let it guide you forward." They sat in silence for a few moments longer, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Richard stood up, a new determination evident in his posture. "We should get back to Emma. I promised her we wouldn't be long. As they walked back toward the hospital entrance, Richard found himself scanning the distant hills, half expecting to see a chestnut horse watching them from afar. The landscape remained empty of any such presence, yet Richard couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, the mysterious animal that had saved his daughter was still somehow connected to them, a living link to an experience that had changed everything. The days that followed brought steady improvement in Emma's condition. The tissue damage around the bite began to heal, her kidney function remained stable, and the doctors gradually reduced her pain medication. Each small victory was celebrated by Richard, who maintained his vigil at her bedside, leaving only when absolutely necessary. Claire stayed in Sedona, taking a leave of absence from her job to help with Emma's recovery. She watched with quiet satisfaction as Richard devoted himself to his daughter's care, reading to her, playing card games when Emma had the energy, or simply sitting with her, talking in a way they hadn't for years. On the fourth day of Emma's hospitalization, Mike Evans, the search and rescue team leader who had helped find her, came to visit. He brought a small stuffed horse as a gift, which made Emma smile despite her lingering weakness. "How are you feeling, kiddo?" Mike asked, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "Better," Emma replied. "They say I might get to go home next week if everything keeps getting better." Mike nodded approvingly. "That's great news. You're a tough one, you know that? Not everyone would have handled what you went through with such courage." Emma's expression grew serious. "Have you seen the horse again, when you're out on rescues or patrols?" Mike glanced at Richard before answering, clearly gauging what approach to take. "No, I haven't," he said finally, opting for straightforward honesty. "But I've been asking around, talking to rangers and wildlife experts about what happened." "And?" Richard prompted when Mike hesitated. Mike shifted in his chair, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Well, that's the thing. No one has a good explanation. Wild horses sometimes approach humans out of curiosity, but what this one did, staying with Emma, carrying her, approaching the search party instead of fleeing, it's not typical behavior, not even close." Emma nodded, as if this confirmation of the horse's unusual actions validated what she already knew. "It was special," she said simply. "It certainly was," Mike agreed, his expression thoughtful. "You know, there are stories among some of the local indigenous people about spirit animals, creatures that appear to help humans in times of need." Richard tensed slightly, unsure where this conversation was heading and whether it was helpful for Emma to entertain such notions. "Are you saying the horse was a spirit?" Emma asked, her eyes wide. Mike held up his hands. "I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm just saying there are things that happen out in the wilderness that aren't easily explained by science or logic. This might be one of those things." Before the conversation could continue further, Dr. Abernathy arrived for her rounds. Mike said his goodbyes, promising to visit again before Emma was discharged, and left with a friendly nod to Richard and Claire. As the doctor examined Emma's leg, Richard found himself mulling over Mike's words. The idea of spirit animals or supernatural intervention went against everything in his rational worldview. Yet he couldn't deny the extraordinary nature of what had occurred, nor could he offer a better explanation. "The healing is progressing nicely," Dr. Abernathy announced, rewrapping the bandage around Emma's ankle. "The swelling has gone down significantly and there's no sign of infection. If this continues, we might be able to discharge you in a few days, as long as you promise to take it easy at home." Emma's face lit up. "Really? I can go home soon?" "That's the plan," the doctor confirmed with a smile. "Though you'll need to come back for follow-up appointments and you'll have physical therapy to help regain full strength and mobility in your leg." After the doctor left, Emma turned to Richard, her expression suddenly serious. "Dad, when we go home, can we go back to the cabin instead of Phoenix? I want to look for the horse." Richard had been anticipating this request since their earlier conversation, but he still wasn't prepared for it. "Emma, I'm not sure that's a good idea. You'll need to rest and recover, and the cabin is pretty isolated." "But we could just stay for a few days," Emma persisted. "Just long enough to see if the horse comes back. Please, Dad, it's important." Richard glanced at Claire, seeking support, but she merely raised her eyebrows, leaving the decision to him. He looked back at Emma, at the pleading in her eyes, and found himself wavering. Was it so unreasonable to grant her this request? After all, she had been through a traumatic experience, and perhaps returning to the scene of it would provide some kind of closure. "Let me think about it," he said finally. "We'll need to see what the doctor says about your travel restrictions and whether it would be safe for you to be that far from medical care so soon after being discharged." Emma seemed to sense that this wasn't an outright refusal, and she nodded, accepting the compromise for now. "Okay, but promise you'll really think about it? Not just say you will and then decide no?" The question stung, a reminder of all the times he had brushed off her requests or made empty promises he had no intention of keeping. "I promise, Emma. I'll really think about it, and we'll make the decision together, based on what's best for your recovery." That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, Richard stepped out into the hospital corridor to make some phone calls. He needed to extend his leave of absence from work, arrange for their house in Phoenix to be looked after for a bit longer, and most importantly, check on the condition of the cabin. If there was even a possibility of taking Emma there after her discharge, he needed to make sure it was properly prepared, stocked with supplies, cleaned, and comfortable for someone recovering from a serious injury. As he finished his calls, he noticed a woman standing at the far end of the corridor, looking out a window. Something about her posture, the way she stood with her weight shifted slightly to one side, one hand resting on the windowsill, reminded him so forcefully of Sarah that for a moment he couldn't breathe. It was as if the past and present had collided, blurring the boundaries between them. The woman turned, revealing a face that bore no resemblance to Sarah's, and the spell was broken. Richard exhaled slowly, steadying himself against the wall. These moments had been frequent in the first year after Sarah's death, but they had gradually faded as time passed. Now, in the wake of Emma's accident and the mysterious intervention of the horse, they were returning with renewed intensity. He thought again of Emma's words. "It reminded me of Mom, the way it looked at me, like it knew me." Could there be some truth to that feeling? Not literally, of course. Richard couldn't bring himself to believe in reincarnation or that Sarah's spirit was somehow inhabiting a wild horse. But perhaps something of Sarah's essence, her love for Emma, had manifested in this inexplicable event. Perhaps the universe had a way of protecting those who were loved even after the ones who loved them were gone. It was a fanciful thought, more suited to Sarah's worldview than his own. Yet as he returned to Emma's room and looked at his sleeping daughter, peaceful despite everything she had endured, Richard found himself embracing the mystery rather than fighting it. Whatever had happened in that forest, whatever force had guided that horse to Emma's side, he was simply grateful for the outcome. A week after her admission to the hospital, Emma was deemed well enough to be discharged. Dr. Abernathy provided detailed instructions for her continued care, keeping the wound clean, taking antibiotics to prevent infection, attending physical therapy sessions, and gradually increasing activity as her strength returned. The doctor emphasized that while Emma was healing well, complete recovery would take time and patience. "And what about traveling?" Richard asked, thinking of Emma's request to return to the cabin. "Is it safe for her to be away from medical facilities?" Dr. Abernathy considered the question. "As long as you're within an hour or so of emergency care, it should be fine. Just make sure she takes her medications as scheduled and doesn't overexert herself." She glanced at Emma, who was watching the conversation with barely concealed eagerness. "I'm guessing there's somewhere specific you want to go." Emma nodded. "Our cabin. It's where everything happened." Understanding dawned in the doctor's eyes. "Ah, I see. You want to go back to where you encountered the horse." She smiled gently. "That makes sense. Sometimes returning to the scene of a traumatic event can be part of the healing process. Just be prepared for the possibility that the horse won't be there, Emma. Wild animals rarely stay in one area for long." "I know," Emma said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "But I still want to try." Richard, seeing the determination in his daughter's eyes, made his decision. "All right. We'll go to the cabin for a few days before heading back to Phoenix." The smile that lit up Emma's face made any reservations he might have had instantly dissolve. Claire had already gone ahead to the cabin to prepare it, stocking the refrigerator with food, airing out the rooms, and making up the beds with fresh linens. When Richard pulled up in front of the rustic wooden structure with Emma in the passenger seat, Claire was waiting on the porch, a warm smile on her face. "Welcome back," she called, coming to help Emma from the car. Though Emma could walk short distances with crutches, longer stretches still required a wheelchair, which Richard unfolded from the trunk. Emma looked around eagerly as Claire pushed her wheelchair up the ramp they had temporarily installed over the front steps. "It looks different in the daylight," she commented. "Less scary." Richard followed with their bags, his own gaze scanning the surrounding forest edge. The cabin sat in a small clearing, with dense woods on three sides and a spectacular view of the red rock formations in the distance. Somewhere out there, the mysterious horse might still be roaming, or it might have moved on miles away, never to be seen again. He hoped, for Emma's sake, that it was the former. The interior of the cabin was warm and inviting, with a fire already crackling in the stone fireplace. Claire had transformed what had been a rarely used vacation property into a proper convalescent home, with Emma's bedroom set up on the main floor to avoid stairs, and extra pillows and blankets within easy reach. "This is perfect, Claire," Richard said gratefully, setting down their bags. "Thank you for doing all this." Claire waved away his thanks. "It was no trouble. Besides, I think this is exactly what both of you need right now, some time away from everything, just to be together." After they had settled in and Emma had rested from the journey, they sat down to the dinner Claire had prepared. As they ate, Emma kept glancing out the window as if expecting to see the horse appear at any moment. "How are we going to look for it?" she asked eventually, turning her attention back to Richard. "We can't exactly hike through the woods with my leg like this." Richard had been considering this very problem. "I thought we might drive to some of the lookout points tomorrow," he suggested. "Places with good views of the valley where wild horses are known to graze. We could bring binoculars and see if we spot any horses that match the one that helped you." "And if we do see it?" Claire asked, voicing the question Richard had been avoiding. "Then we'll figure out the next step," he replied, not wanting to make promises he couldn't keep. "The important thing is to be patient. This might take time, Emma." Emma nodded, but Richard could see the mixture of hope and impatience in her expression. She wanted so badly to find the horse again, to confirm that what had happened wasn't just a venom-induced hallucination or a freak occurrence, but something meaningful and real. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Richard and Claire sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cool night air. The sky above was a tapestry of stars, more brilliant and numerous than anything visible from the light-polluted city. "Do you really think there's a chance of finding the horse?" Claire asked softly, her voice barely disturbing the profound silence of the forest night. Richard sighed. "Honestly, I don't know. The odds seem incredibly slim, but I couldn't say no to Emma, not after everything she's been through." "And what about you?" Claire turned to look at him. "What are you hoping to find out here?" The question caught him off guard. He had been so focused on Emma's desire to find the horse that he hadn't fully examined his own motivations. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "Closure, maybe, or answers to questions I'm not even sure how to ask." Claire nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about what Emma said, about the horse reminding her of Sarah. It's a strange thing to say, isn't it? But then again, children often have a way of perceiving things that adults miss." Richard stared out at the dark outline of the forest. "I keep thinking about the last time we were all here together, the three of us. It was about a month before Sarah died. We spent the whole weekend just hiking and exploring. Sarah was so alive, so full of energy and joy." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Emma was only 9 then, but she remembers it all so clearly. Sometimes I think her memories of Sarah are more vivid than mine. "That's because you've been trying not to remember," Claire said gently. "It hurts too much, so you've pushed those memories away. Emma hasn't done that. She's held on to every moment with her mother." Richard knew she was right. He had deliberately buried himself in work, in routines and responsibilities that left no time for grief or reflection. He had stopped coming to the cabin, stopped looking at old photos, stopped talking about Sarah, all in an effort to dull the pain of her absence. And in doing so, he had distanced himself from Emma, the living embodiment of Sarah's legacy. "I've made so many mistakes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can fix them all." Claire reached out and squeezed his hand. "You don't have to fix everything at once, Richard. Just being here, doing this for Emma, it's a start, and it's a good one." They sat in companionable silence for a while longer, listening to the night sounds of the forest, the soft hooting of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, the distant call of a coyote. Somewhere out there, perhaps, was a horse that had defied all natural instinct to save a human child. Whether they would find it again remained to be seen, but Richard realized that the search itself was already healing something broken between him and Emma, creating a shared purpose, a common goal that bound them together in a way they hadn't been for years. As he finally rose to go inside, Richard paused at the door, looking back at the darkened forest one last time. "We're here," he said quietly, not sure who or what he was addressing. "We've come back." Morning arrived with golden light filtering through the pines, casting dappled shadows across the cabin's wooden porch. Emma was up early, her excitement overriding the discomfort of her healing leg. Richard found her already dressed and in her wheelchair by the front window, gazing out at the forest with expectant eyes. "You're up early," he commented, moving to the kitchen to start coffee. "How did you sleep?" "Okay," Emma replied, not taking her eyes from the window. "I had a dream about the horse. It was standing right there at the edge of the trees watching the cabin." Richard paused, coffee pot in hand. "Just a dream? Or do you think it was actually there?" Emma turned to look at him, and the certainty in her eyes gave him pause. "I think it's close, Dad. I can feel it." After breakfast, they set out in Richard's SUV, with Emma's wheelchair folded in the back and a pair of binoculars in her lap. Claire had opted to stay behind, sensing that this was something father and daughter needed to do together. They drove slowly along the forest roads, stopping at overlooks that provided views of the valleys and meadows where wild horses sometimes grazed. At each stop, Emma scanned the landscape with the binoculars, her focus unwavering despite the heat of the day and the discomfort of sitting in the car for extended periods. Richard watched her, marveling at her determination. It reminded him of Sarah, who had never given up easily on anything she believed in. "There!" Emma exclaimed suddenly during their fourth stop of the morning. "Dad, I see horses." Richard took the binoculars she thrust at him and followed her pointing finger. Sure enough, in a distant meadow, a small herd of wild horses was grazing, their shapes tiny but distinct against the green background. "Can we get closer?" Emma asked, her voice tight with suppressed excitement. "Please, Dad." Richard hesitated. The meadow was at least half a mile from the nearest accessible road, and Emma couldn't walk that far. But the hope in her eyes was impossible to deny. "I have an idea," he said. "Wait here." He returned to the SUV and pulled out the lightweight camping chair they had brought along. Then, with careful movements, he helped Emma from the car into the chair. "I'll carry you," he explained, picking up the chair with Emma in it. "It's not too far, and you're not too heavy." Emma's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. "Really? You'd do that?" Richard nodded, already beginning the trek down the gentle slope toward the meadow. "Of course. This is important to you, so it's important to me." The journey was more strenuous than Richard had anticipated. The uneven ground made balancing the chair difficult, and Emma's weight, though not excessive, became increasingly noticeable as they progressed. Sweat beaded on his forehead and his arms began to ache, but he pressed on, determined not to let Emma down again. As they approached the edge of the meadow, Richard slowed his pace, not wanting to startle the horses into fleeing. The herd, consisting of about a dozen animals, continued grazing peacefully, apparently unconcerned by their presence. "Do you see it?" Richard asked quietly, setting the chair down in a spot with a clear view. "Is your horse among them?" Emma scanned the herd intently, her expression a mixture of hope and growing disappointment. "No," she said finally, her voice small. "None of them is the right color, and none of them moves the same way. It's not here." Richard felt a pang of sadness for her disappointment, yet also a hint of relief. He had been uncertain about what would happen if they actually found the horse, what expectations Emma might have had that would inevitably be unfulfilled. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he said, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Maybe we can try another spot tomorrow." Emma nodded, but the light had dimmed in her eyes. They watched the horses for a while longer, appreciating their wild beauty from afar, before Richard carefully carried Emma back to the car. The return journey was made in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts. As they rounded the final bend in the road leading to the cabin, Emma suddenly gripped Richard's arm. "Dad, stop the car!" Richard braked immediately, alarmed. "What is it? Are you in pain?" But Emma was staring out the window, her face transformed with wonder. "Look," she whispered, pointing toward the cabin. There, standing perfectly still beside the porch steps, was a chestnut horse with a distinctive white blaze on its forehead, exactly matching the description of the horse that had saved Emma's life. It was watching the approaching vehicle with alert ears and an uncannily intelligent gaze. "It's him," Emma breathed, tears springing to her eyes. "It's really him." Richard stared in disbelief. The horse showed no sign of fear or wildness. It stood as if it had been waiting for them, as if their return was expected. As he watched, Claire appeared on the porch, her expression one of amazement as she gestured toward the horse. "What do we do?" Richard asked, his voice hushed as if he might shatter the moment with too loud a sound. "I need to go to him," Emma said, already fumbling with her seatbelt. "Help me, Dad, please." With careful movements, Richard helped Emma into her wheelchair and slowly pushed her toward the cabin. The horse remained where it was, watching their approach with those keen, knowing eyes that seemed to hold more awareness than any animal Richard had ever encountered. When they were about 10 feet away, Richard stopped, uncertain about approaching closer. Wild horses, no matter how calm they appeared, were unpredictable and potentially dangerous. But Emma had no such reservations. "I can walk from here," she insisted, reaching for her crutches. Richard hesitated, then helped her stand, keeping a supportive hand on her elbow as she took a tentative step forward. The horse watched, its ears pricked forward with interest. When Emma took another step, it mirrored her movement, taking a single step toward her. They continued this delicate dance until they were just a few feet apart, girl and horse regarding each other with a silence that seemed filled with unspoken communication. "Hello again," Emma said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You found me." The horse nickered softly, a gentle sound that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. Then, in a movement that drew gasps from both Richard and Claire, it lowered its head and gently pressed its muzzle against Emma's outstretched palm. Tears streamed freely down Emma's face as she stroked the horse's nose. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. "I knew you were real." Richard stood transfixed, unable to process what he was witnessing. This was no ordinary wild horse. This was something else, something he had no framework to understand, but could no longer deny. As he watched Emma communing with the mysterious animal that had saved her life, a strange peace settled over him. Whether this was Sarah's spirit, some kind of guardian angel, or simply an extraordinary animal with an inexplicable connection to his daughter, it didn't matter. What mattered was the joy illuminating Emma's face, the healing happening before his eyes. The horse stayed for nearly an hour, allowing Emma to stroke its neck and talk to it in low, private tones that Richard couldn't hear. Then, with a final gentle nudge against Emma's shoulder, it turned and walked unhurriedly back into the forest, disappearing among the trees as mysteriously as it had appeared. Emma watched it go with a serene smile, no trace of sadness in her expression. "It's okay," she said when Richard came to stand beside her. "It's not goodbye." "Not really." Richard put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "You think it will come back?" Emma looked up at him, her eyes clear and knowing in a way that reminded him forcefully of Sarah. "I think it will always be with us, Dad, just like Mom." As they stood together, looking toward the forest where the horse had vanished, Richard felt something shift and settle within him, a wound beginning to heal, a connection reforged. Whatever forces had brought that horse to Emma's side in her moment of need had also brought Richard back to his daughter, back to the present, back to life. And for that, he would be forever grateful.